So Bitcoin and the environment. So Bitcoin's share in terms of metric tons of CO2 equivalent is 0.18%. So put that in context, that's a little less than gold mining. And actually it ranks just behind Venezuela in terms of the amount of pollution if Bitcoin were to be a country. So Bitcoin isn't perfect in terms of its environmental impact, but the good thing is that its sustainable energy mix is improving, and it's currently sitting at 54.5%. So as more and more renewable infrastructure gets built out, Bitcoin will probably be involved in that, and more energy will be directed, or more energy in the Bitcoin network will be coming from those sources. And that's largely just due to economics as well and political incentives. So the cheapest energy is actually from the renewable energy sources, especially as we go over time. This will be certainly the case because non-renewable energies get used up and then thus become more expensive over time. Whereas renewable energy is renewable, and so it should be more cheaper over the long run, and therefore Bitcoin should use more and more of this over time. Plus, there are regulations in place that ensure that Bitcoin is being pushed towards renewable energy rather than non-renewable energy. So Bitcoin mining is about 55% green energy mix. If you compare that across other sectors, you have banking sector, which is almost 40%, industrial sector 32%, gold industry almost 13%, for example. So quite good when you compare to other industries. So Bitcoin here is where it is in its little bubble of CO2 production. It's definitely less than data centers and gold mining, tobacco. It's just a little bit more than tobacco. Definitely less than TVs, TV networks, and electronics. And when you compare it to, say, gas flaring and landfills, this is a lot of CO2 being wasted in these two areas that Bitcoin can actually help reduce, which we'll talk about in a next. So methane gas flaring is super important. When you're mining for oil, there's natural gas that sits in the oil wells, and sometimes that natural gas is used and funneled out and used as energy and transported as energy. But not all of it is. There's a lot of wells in the world that is just too far away, and it's too expensive to transport that gas. Okay, so it requires specialist, pretty expensive infrastructure to move gas around. So what they do is they just vent it. Now, sometimes these energy companies who are extracting this oil, they will flare the methane, okay, which is great, but not always they will, because there is a cost to it, and it becomes, economically unviable to do so, or they just don't want to spend the money to flare the methane. Now, it's important to flare the methane because methane is 80 times more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. Okay, so it's incredibly damaging as a greenhouse gas, and so it's important that it's better to burn it to CO2 than to keep it as methane, for example. And there's 120 metric tons of CH4 methane released annually, so it's quite a significant amount of greenhouse gas being emitted annually that we should be trying to get rid of. Now, this was a white paper released by the White House Office of Science and Technology, and they actually concluded that Bitcoin could yield positive results for the climate and is more likely to help rather than hinder US climate objectives because of its ability to incentivize building out methane gas flaring. And Tivian Energy, they did a calculation that mining 1 Bitcoin with vented CH4 is equivalent to taking 1,400 passenger vehicles off the road. So to help you understand the economics of how this makes sense, you're an energy company and you're looking to extract oil from a well. Now, if the costs of building out the infrastructure to flare the methane that comes out of the oil well are too high, then the project viability is doesn't make sense. They're not going to build out the infrastructure to flare the gas. They're just going to allow it to vent into the atmosphere. This happens all the time. Very regular occurrence in the energy industry, and governments are trying to regulate around the world that this shouldn't happen, but it's not always effective, and not all jurisdictions are going to do that as well. What we need is economic incentives to try and build out the flaring infrastructure. So if you tap Bitcoin mining onto these wells, you can actually reduce the costs, right? So the revenue could come in and help subsidize the cost of building that infrastructure, and therefore make the project more viable. Maybe in some cases, the costs, there still will be cost to the company, but it'd be less than they would otherwise would be, so they would be happy to take the hit. But in some cases, the Bitcoin revenue is so much more that they can actually make a profit. And so they're almost definitely going to build out the infrastructure to flare the methane, to turn that methane and that heat into electricity, and then create money from the Bitcoin mining. A similar concept can be applied in landfill gas. So 50% of US landfills vent their CH4 emissions, and the other 50%, they use that methane gas to generate electricity and pump that into the grid. But not always this makes economic sense, because those landfills aren't close to any demand. So in those cases, you can tap a Bitcoin miner onto those landfills and start, to pay for the infrastructure, to burn it, and then to turn it into electricity. And this is what nodal power is doing in the US. So they don't have enough demand around in some landfill areas, so they build out the infrastructure and pump that electricity into Bitcoin mining, thus flaring the methane gas, turning it into CO2, and thus reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that landfill produces. So a Bitcoin mining case study happened in Africa during COVID. So when COVID happened, the tourism dropped off, and it became very difficult for that national park to stay solvent, to pay for all the infrastructure, the employees, the security, to prevent poachers, things like this. So what they did is, with their current hydropowered plants, they put on 10 shipping containers, each with 250 to 500 mining rigs, and turned those hydropower plants into money. They were able to, at one point, produce $150,000 per month, and this effectively saved the national park from bankruptcy. Other examples, World Economic Forum is talking about how being able to generate money from renewable energy sources or available energy sources can help produce and encourage, to help enable commerce in developing countries. And just to help you understand again the economics of how Bitcoin subsidizes the build out of new renewable energy sources. So say you have some natural resources where you have a potential dam that could be built, or you have some geothermal. Now, if the costs outweigh the potential revenue, i.e. the demand for that electricity every year, then it's unlikely the project's going to be built unless it's heavily subsidized by the government. So what Bitcoin can do is push that revenue or that demand over the costs, thus making the project economically viable and sustainable even without government intervention. And there's an academic paper showing that this is actually possible, and the market is actually doing this already. So what is the big idea? Bitcoin reduces methane emissions by incentivizing the build out of methane flaring infrastructure, and methane flaring infrastructure on landfills. It also incentivizes new renewable energy projects.